everyone. Thanks for attending this session. So my name is Shannon Misialek, and I am a faculty member in athletic training. And so I'm happy to have you guys here today. I laughed. I found this cartoon actually this morning, and I thought it was pretty funny. So I left a little blank mark in the watermarks and credit for it. I do want to take a second to, you'll probably see this a couple times today, but I just wanted to take an opportunity to recognize that we are land grant and our land grant statement. So I'll give you a second to read that. I do also want to take a second and say I don't have any disclosures, but I do want to mention that I am a Crucial Conversations, Crucial Learnings instructor, and I also have a Working Genius training certificate as well, and so that I can facilitate those courses. And so because of that, you may see, anyone familiar with either one of those? So you'll likely see some of the things or hear some of those things intertwined within this conversation. So my hope for today is to give you a template as they prepare for a difficult conversation. And this sounds kind of silly because it's hard to have or start the conversation, right? But a template's a nice way to kind of maybe help facilitate that process. The problem with that though is that, you just never know where the conversation is going to go. So hopefully this will just give you a general idea of where to go, things to look out for, things to think about as you navigate through a challenging conversation, with the end goal of hoping that you'll feel more confident with your ability to have difficult conversations. So to get us started, those on Zoom, you can raise your hand if you choose to, but this is more so rhetorical because I think even people feel uncomfortable raising their hand to say, yeah, I totally have a difficult conversation in my mind that I really want to talk about, but I don't know how to start that conversation. I've been thinking about it for weeks or months or days or years, but I don't know where to begin. But what we do know, and I purposely wrote down these stats so I didn't mess them up, it happens all the time. In fact, 85% of employees felt that they've had to deal with a communication conflict. And being a healthcare provider, I think specifically about medicine often, but I thought this was a crazy stat. It said 84% of doctors or physicians have seen a coworker take a dangerous shortcut, not even just a shortcut, a dangerous shortcut to patient care, but fewer than 10% have actually voiced that concern. That's shocking to me, right? That's a pretty high stat. So I want you to take a second and think about a conversation that you want to have. It could be personal, it could be professional, and use that as we talk through today. And I'll give you chances throughout the presentation to kind of reflect back on how you can apply what you're talking or what we're talking about today with that particular conversation. So now as we're talking, I kind of left this generic term of difficult conversation out there, but what I want to do actually is get your thoughts about that. So I created a poll everywhere. What words would you use to define the term difficult conversation? Take a second, try the poll, tell me what you think. Ooh, awkward, absolutely. Comfortable, I like that one.
Say high risk.
Ooh, high risk, absolutely. I like that word choice. Linda, can you tell me what's in the chat?
Conflicting, uncomfortable.
Uncomfortable, good. Like it. Landmines. Well, that's I like that one. Okay. Hopefully that's not the case. Conflicting, necessary. I love that. We're going to talk a little bit about that actually. We'll give you another 30 seconds or so to kind of add in anything else you might want to add to that. So there are many definitions, but you'll see that there are a lot of common themes that pop up when we talk about the different definitions. Anything someone doesn't want to talk about. Yeah, that's pretty simplified, right? It's just hard, but why, right? What makes it difficult? And in these other two conversations we see, or the other two definitions we see, emotional, hurt feelings. People care, right? There's these high stakes part of it, strong emotions. And ultimately there's just difference of an opinion, right? The Crucial Conversations one creates it as a pyramid and they call it the opposing opinions, but just people care and they are thinking differently. So it's important to kind of have that conversation. And I'm saying that it's important to have this conversation, but people are wondering, well, I can just avoid it, right? It'll be fine. Well, instead of doing or having the conversation, 50% of people just get angry, right? So now they're emotionally driven. They're not getting their work done because they're thinking about this and they're just mad. 53% of people ruminate about the problem. Again, they're just doing. 66% of people do unnecessary work. So they're saying, I'm not going to have this conversation and I'm just going to do it myself. It might take me a few extra hours, but I'm just going to do it myself. Most people complain to others. Everyone's got their work significant other, who's got their best pal, and they're talking to them, right? Which usually is pretty good. But if we're constantly complaining to each other, what kind of environment is that creating for us? And so if we can actually have these conversations, it transforms people and it creates stronger quality relationships. So why don't we interact? I think most of the time people are worried about the outcome. They don't want to be vulnerable. They don't want to be willing to share those feelings or thoughts with other people. And I thought this was interesting. So I wanted to share this, but half of the respondents wasted 7 days or more avoiding a crucial conversation on average. So sometimes longer, sometimes shorter. When I've done this training before, I've had people say, well, I've been thinking about this conversation with my kid for 6 months. I'm like, oh gosh, you waited 6 months. That's how nervous or how important it is to you for it to go well. But I did laugh this morning because even the speaker said, avoidance is not a strategy. You need to address it. And so hopefully with these first couple of slides, I'm selling to you why it's important to actually start the conversation. That was the topic or the title of this session. So let's talk about strategies that we can use to actually do that. The first thing they often say, or one of the things strategies that we can do to work through having a difficult conversation is start with our heart. The one person you can control is yourself. Oftentimes people have conversations and they say, well, gosh, I just wish she would listen. I wish she would show up on time. And they're having these expectations of somebody else. But at the end of the day, the only person you can control is yourself. So we're going to talk about a couple ways to do that. But the first thing is simply just getting yourself under control. And that might mean controlling your emotions first. Often we're in situations and we're so angry and you say something really fast, really reactive. And then later you look back and you're like, oh gosh, I kind of wish I hadn't said that. Right? So taking that extra minute to think about what you really want to say. So I've had colleagues that have done talks like this too, and their recommendation is wait 24 hours. And it might need to be 24 hours, but it also might be 2 weeks. If you really feel like you need that time to get yourself together, then do it. That's okay. You want to be able to stay focused in the conversation on what you really want during the conversation. What do you want to happen at the end? And so part of that conversation is knowing what you want before you have the conversation. So during that reflection time, prior to actually having the conversation, you should be asking yourself, what do I want to happen during this conversation? What do I hope to gain? And on the flip side of that, you should also be thinking about what you don't want to happen. I don't want to burn this bridge. I don't want this to get really emotionally involved. I want to continue to be able to work with this person in a positive way. So how can I make that happen? And that kind of leads into that refocusing your brain. Because once you have all of these things in the forefront, I've even had people say, I've written these things down at the top of my sheet of paper during our conversation, because then I can always go back to it. When I'm feeling frustrated, when I'm in the heat of the conversation, I can look back and say, this was my focus. This was my hope. This is why we're having this conversation. And you can return to dialogue. So right now, I'm initially talking about pre-conversation. We're not actually there. But during the conversation, you can keep thinking about these things. Keep recognizing what's actually happening. And if you need time to stay focused, maybe we say something during the meeting like, we're getting kind of heated. We're maybe not going in a productive way. Let's take a quick 10-minute bathroom break. Let's do X, Y, and Z to go grab a drink and come back to the conversation. Or maybe it's so heated and you're feeling that this is not going in the way that you want. And you say, gosh, this maybe isn't going great. Let's take a break and try and reschedule for tomorrow or check back at our session tomorrow. So people have time to cool down and reflect. So going back to working on me first, one of the things that I think is really helpful is to understand how you as a person handle and manage stress during a difficult conversation. So you can go to this QR code, and in the QR code, it's a 30-question questionnaire. It sounds like a lot, but it should only take you a couple minutes. And it's going to give you an idea about how you handle stress. I'll let you guys go ahead and do that first. And then we'll talk about what you're going to get from. How are we doing? Are we getting towards the results? Are people seeing should look something like this? Let's talk about the results we're just looking at. So typically what we find is when people enter into a stressful conversation, they tend to move in one of two ways, either towards silence or violence. So silence is exactly what it sounds like, where people just stop contributing to the conversation because they don't feel safe about what's happening, or they decide that they don't feel like their voice is being heard. And so they just feel like, why am I going to talk if you're not going to hear me anyway? I have seen this be as extreme as in situations where people actually leave. That's also still considered silence. On the opposite end, there's violence. And I don't really love that term, but we're not talking about violence in the true sense of violence, but we're talking about the people who, when they get angry or upset, constantly interrupt, or start to yell, or they use their hand motions a lot, and they'll be like, no. What's great about this is typically people kind of have a sense of where they fall into these categories. Was anyone surprised by their response? or by the results. What I think is interesting for people though, is understanding how our other person responds. The other person in the conversation, do they typically move towards silence or violence? And so we're starting with us by trying to figure that out and recognizing how we respond in stressful situations, but it's also important to think about the other person. And so during your conversation, it's important to think about that. Have they stopped talking? Are they constantly interrupting you? Are they yelling? Why is that? It's because they don't feel safe in the conversation, or they don't, and I don't mean, I hope it's not physically safe, but we're talking about feeling willing to be vulnerable, willing to be comfortable to have that conversation with you. We're talking about physical safety, that's a whole separate conversation. So hopefully for us, one of our biggest goals during the conversation should be to make it safe so that everybody can contribute to the conversation. Because the more people that we have involved, the better the ideas are. Questions about this so far?
Yeah, and do you feel like it can kind of change depending on who you're with? Because I think like if I'm thinking about this in a work setting, I think I'm a lot different than if I'm thinking about it with my husband. I'm probably a little bit different depending on the situation.
Absolutely. I think not only the situation, but who the person is, right? How comfortable you feel with that person and what kind of relationship you have with them. Because I think so too. I'd say often I resort to silence. Like it's just by nature how I am. Like I just kind of take it in and I just listen. Sometimes with my husband, I'm more willing to tell him what I'm really thinking, right? But the goal should be that you want to be willing to be able to say the things that you need to. Because if you can't say the things that you need to, you're going to act it out later. And you're not going to feel like the conversation is resolved. So you need to be able to say those things. So figuring out how to make that happen is important. But yes, I absolutely agree. So often one of the questions I get is, okay, I notice or recognize that these things are happening. The person's getting really quiet. What do I do about it? There are a variety of different things that you can do. We only have 45 minutes today, and so we don't have all of those things. Usually I like to practice those things and work through some of those things, but even reflections or specifically asking them, I noticed that you haven't said anything. I'm curious to hear what you're thinking, trying to get them to come back to the conversation. So we have this conversation that we want to have. We know it's this, because we've had this disagreement, right? We've interacted with this person. We're emotional about it. We're running it through our brain, ready, right? We're potentially ruminating about it, thinking about how that could have gone differently, what happened there. And you start saying, okay, I had this situation, this person showed up late, they didn't do what they were supposed to, they must not respect me. They don't care about me, they don't care about this work. And you start telling yourself all of these stories. So when we think about that, we need to be able to master that story. And so there's a variety of different ways that we can do that. The first thing is noticing your behavior, right? Noticing right away that I'm spiraling a little bit, right? Like I'm moving away from what the actual facts were, making sure that we're getting in touch with our feelings, making sure that we're just not, we're not responding out of because you're mad, okay? We want to take time to analyze that story to get back to those facts. And I have a video for us that I think will be helpful for that. So I use those terms, facts versus stories, but we haven't really talked about those. So facts are typically things that we can see and hear. They're observable. In the research world, I would say they're objective. I'm mad at this person because they were late. Whereas the story of that is the emotion, the subjective aspect that I included in that conversation, or the opinions I've made about it. They were late because they don't care about this work. Well, I don't know that, right? It's just something I've told myself because I'm frustrated. So it's really important to be able to differentiate between those two things. And sometimes it gets a little complicated. This video, I think, is pretty cheesy, but I think they do a really nice job of talking about facts versus stories. And they use some terminology that I think is really great. So let's watch this.
So one of the things that really slows down work productivity and kills powerful conversations is when individuals and teams don't make a distinction between facts and stories. Facts are what a video camera would record. It's unarguable. A story is what you literally make up in your mind. It's an opinion, a judgment, a belief, what you imagine. So we want to play a little game here and show you how it works. Diana and I are going to go back and forth, and we're going to say, I notice, and that'll be a fact. And then we're going to say, and I imagine, and that'll be a story. And we'll just go back and forth so you can hear the distinction between the two. You want to start?
Sure. I notice you putting your lips together, and I imagine that you're withholding yourself to let me talk.
I notice your eyebrow went up when you said withholding yourself to let me talk. And I imagine you were excited about saying that.
I notice the gray in your hair. And I imagine that sometimes that's been hard for you to allow your aging to show up here.
I notice you asked Carson to go get us sandwiches and bring them back. I imagine you're actually a fantastic hostess.
I noticed that I didn't show up for our group call the other night, and I imagine that you were sad about that or angry.
There you go. Fact, story. I notice only what a video camera would record. Imagine, here's what I make up. Great teams distinguish those.
What'd you think of that video? It's definitely cheesy, right? What were some of the facts that they talked about? Or examples of facts that they used?
Not showing up. for
Not
any
showing up.
call.
Yep. Being late. Something objective. You can see it. You can look at the clock. What else?
Facial expressions.
Facial expressions, body language. We haven't even talked about that and how that impacts the conversation. Absolutely. What else? Other things that you can think of maybe in conversations that you've had? Oh, go ahead.
Tone of voice.
Yeah, tone of voice. Tone of voice is hard, right? Because you could say, I noticed that your tone changed, and then you have to see what that means. Because you might think that that means that they're angry, but it also just means that they don't know what to say or that they're defensive. But it's great because it helps us indicate, it helps us get to that idea of, are they still feeling safe? Like, is this still a good conversation? One of the things I really liked about that is that they say, I noticed, right? So hopefully facts, and then that led them to their story. You could say things like, it made me feel like I wondered about. So what I want you to do is take a second and think about the conversations that you thought about at the beginning that maybe you should be having. And think about, take a minute, write down, what are the facts of the story? Or what are the facts of the conversation that you want to have? So now that you have those facts, I think this video does a really nice job of talking about how you can use those facts in the conversation. So let's watch this.
So when it's clear that someone is making a decision that may be based on some biases they have, I think one of the important things to remember as you address the conversation is really mastering your own story about why that person may be doing it. Could there be other reasons for the decision that maybe you're not aware of? Maybe it's limited information or possibly even exposure that they may have that could be impacting that decision. Us, again, starting with working on ourselves first, kind of mastering our own stories, is going to be the catalyst when we actually engage in that discussion. And so as you go into the conversation, again, remember, use facts. Last week you decided this, you stated this about this candidate, whatever that topic was, clearly articulate the facts first, and then share your interpretation of those facts, watching how you share that story. Most important, invite them into a dialogue, because again, you are making a guess of what may have influenced that decision, and you really want to get that person to open up and say, yes, I did, and here's a little bit more behind it, or wow, I wasn't even sure that I did that. Please help me figure out how to fix it. It's all about getting us to that dialogue. And so again, I would suggest number one, mastering our story around why they may have made the decision that was made, and number two, using the facts, sharing our story and inviting them into a conversation, which is going to help us really close the gap on some of those biases.
One of the things I really liked about this video is not only does it start to get us in this idea of a template of how we could approach the conversation, but she talks about being open-minded, thinking about the other person's perspective. What could possibly be going on with them at that current moment that happened? So again, I have a colleague who's late and initially I'm frustrated and I feel like they don't care about the project, they don't care about us, but really it could just be their kid woke up late, their kid was sick this morning, right? It could be something very simple that completely unrelated. So you have to be very careful about the stories that you tell yourself. So one of the objectives I said is that I would provide you with a template. And I use this loosely because I do worry, you never know where the conversation is going to go. And it might go completely unexpected and that just happens. But the first thing I like to do is ask for permission to have the conversation. Have a strong opening statement about it. Typically, I ask you guys to think about and brainstorm what type of opening statement you might want to say, because I feel like this is the hardest part. Once you get through this, then you can kind of get rolling, but we're going to run out of time. So I'm just going to, one of my favorite opening statements, because most of the time people will say, I don't know how to start this conversation. I'm really nervous about it. I really want it to go well, and I just don't know what to say. And I'm like, well, say that. Hey, I noticed that a couple of things were happening. I'm really nervous about having this conversation with you, but I think it's really important. I'm wondering if we could set up a time to meet. Notice that I said set up a time to meet. And I've done this for a couple of reasons. Typically, any of these conversations worth having are going to take more than 2 minutes. And so you want to make sure that you have that time. The other piece of that is you want to make sure that this person doesn't feel ambushed and that they have time to prepare for the conversation as well. And so scheduling something allows for that to happen. You know, they might follow up by saying, oh, I'm curious to know what it's about. And we could just say, well, it was about the project that we worked on yesterday, or it's about the conversation that we had last week, whatever the case may be. Then you can kind of give them an idea about what you're gonna at least gonna talk about. Then, just like the video does a really nice job, stating the facts. State exactly what facts why you're having the conversation. Okay? Because we've done our pre-work now and we know what those facts are. Talk about how that maybe made you feel, and or even what conclusions you drew from that. And then be really intentional about inviting them to the conversation. And often people are like, well, what does that mean? I don't want to be like, well, I invited them to the conversation, but we're having it. And I'm like, well, it's really important to ask open-ended questions. Something maybe like, how do you see it? What was your experience? How did you interpret this? Which then hopefully will get them talking. I will say, if they're not talking, often it's because they don't feel safe, right? They don't feel like they can be vulnerable with you and have that conversation. And so when we think about the goals of a conversation, there's three things. We want to find ways to create a safe environment for them to be willing to share, because the more information that we can get out, the better off you are at coming up to a sound conclusion. Again, remembering that we can look for silence or violence during our conversation, keeping in mind that you might have to apologize, or you might have to maybe you said something that you realize wasn't good. Recognize that, own it. You also somebody mentioned body language earlier. Recognize that, think about that. If they're standing there with their arms crossed, their legs are crossed, they're looking around the room, they're rolling their eyes, all red flags. But vice versa. I don't want to be in a situation where this person's sitting and I'm standing. That doesn't set the tone nicely, because we want to get everyone talking. Our hope would be to find a mutual agreement, find something that we all agree on. Other ways that we can get everyone talking, like I said, is to think about those open-ended questions with the intended goal that we'll come to a shared conclusion. Hopefully at the end of the conversation, you get what you wanted. Right at the beginning, we talked about, what do you want out of this conversation? Hopefully you can get there at some level with also compromising with the other person. And maybe you don't need to compromise. Maybe you're both on the same page. You just had a miscommunication. Another thing I really like about a tip that you can do with getting everyone talking is thinking about active listening. I almost felt guilty about not including the word listening in any of my slides, because that's such a large part of this conversation. Showing them that you're listening by reflecting on what they're saying, rephrasing what they're saying. Again, with a longer session, I usually spend time actually practicing those skills. But that's also great, because then you're checking for understanding too. So what I hear you say is, you felt like this because you saw that. And they can say, no, that's not what I'm saying at all. So make sure that we're clarifying those misunderstandings. What questions do we have? I usually do 2 examples, and we're not going to have enough time for that today, but I do have it there so you can work through it. I'm happy to talk about it if you want. And then I also obviously want you to think about the conversation that you have in the back of your mind. How can you apply this template to that conversation? Yes.
I have a question.
Mhm.
How would your approach change if it's something like a conversation you have to have in the here and now and you can't really prepare for the future?
I still keep that template in the back of my mind, thinking about and often for me, I think that that's a nice way to ground the conversation. Like thinking about, okay, what are the facts here? Don't get emotional about this, because that's just going to make it worse. What are the things that we need to have this conversation about? You might not necessarily be able to think about, and in theory, you probably have an end goal in mind already. Otherwise you wouldn't be mad about it. So kind of trying to figure that out sometimes on the fly is not ideal, but it's still the same idea, I would say.
So you talked about like scheduling a meeting in the future. Do you think that's a best practice or not? Because I feel like I kind of go back and forth on that, because it kind of gives the other person maybe some anxiety then about what's going to happen, and like gives them more time to make their own stories as well about why you might want to meet with them. So how do you decide, like, should I just kind of try to not give them a heads up, or I should give them a heads up?
I always err on the side of giving them a heads up.
Okay.
Now, the situation might be, hey, I have time right now. Do you want to talk about it right now? Sure. But I also, when I give them the heads up, I try to be very clear about what the conversation is about. I didn't feel good about our conversation yesterday. I'm really having a hard time understanding where we go from there. I'm wondering if we could talk. Where is it? But I completely agree that if you say like, hey, let's set up a meeting for next week to talk about some things. Well, that leaves that could be a million things. So I don't want that to happen either.
I personally tend to drop the, hey, do you have a minute to chat, or we need to talk, without giving context. And it's not even a difficult conversation. It's just an FYI. I know I do that. I'm trying to be better about giving some context, but it's worth mentioning even on the easy conversations, if they don't know what it's about, stories happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also will say, I think you kind of have to prepare yourself a little bit, right? Like people by nature get defensive. That's just how we're wired. So being prepared for that is important too. But on the flip side, I've had students that say, hey, they send me like, hey, can we meet next week to talk about some things? I'm like, and so most often I'll reply with, absolutely. Can you maybe give me a little bit of context so I can be prepared? Because there's lots of times it's not at all what you think about. And then I'm like, I'm not sure. There are definitely resources for that, but I'm not prepared now.
I think that piece of asking is so important and often something that we don't realize we can do or that will help the conversation. So if someone is like just thinking about a million things and like, oh, we should chat about this. And you're like, what is going on? Am I in trouble? Maybe you don't phrase it that way, but I love how you said it. Like, can you give me a little bit of detail so I can prepare?
Yeah.
There's no more horrific dread than someone scheduling a time to meet and not telling you what it's about.
And you just wonder, right? And then you do tell yourself this terrible
Yeah,
story
it
about
is.
what this could be about.
I'm fired, you have cancer, somebody's dying, somebody's getting divorced. It's so bad. I will generally panic long before that and just beg the person to tell me what it is.
You often see that look on people's faces and I'm like, I promise it's not bad. This is what I'm hoping to talk about, right? Because then you feel terrible about it.
And when you bring the facts and the conversation and the person doesn't agree with the facts or they think the fact is not real, like it's a fact, but on their mind, it's not.
Yeah, I think that's probably where most conversations get hung up is when people are like, well, I wasn't late. Well, we talked about being there at 8 and you didn't show up till 8:30. That we're late, right? It's okay if your kid was sick or whatever, but can we find ways to talk about that? Like maybe, can you send me an email? Can you send me a text? Let me know what's happening so then we can troubleshoot it a little bit. But yeah, that's typically, and that's where emotions get right away, right? You'll have people that are saying, that is not at all what happened. Well, tell me your side. Let me hear what you're saying. Let me hear what you're thinking. And then hopefully you can kind of de-escalate. Perfect. Well, thank you all so much for your time.